Now let's talk about defining an ID. Sometimes you want to set up a style that will only be used one time in one element on a page. So that's particularly helpful for using styles to lay out a page. So now we're starting to talk about the layout of the page. So IDs we use in conjunction with the HTML elements for layout to create interesting and responsive layouts. We'll talk about this more when we get to responsive here in a couple weeks. So to define an ID inside the CSS, we use the # or a hashtag as we're used to indicate that ID. So let's go in here. We now have, we've defined some classes. We've defined just what these tags mean or the style within those. So we're down here. Let's do something called a header. And again, with the curly braces. And I want the width of this header to be 960 pixels. Again, it's a property line, so I close with a semicolon. I want the height to be 100 pixels. And I want the background to be light blue. So to do that, I would now have to include this ID somehow into the page. And we do this most often using two container elements. One is called a div, which that's the main one we're going to be using right now. The other one is called a span, which we'll be using later when we get into JavaScript. So let's focus first on including this into a div. So I'm going to save the style sheet. And now if I go back up to my HTML, I want that header to be right here. So I'm going to include the div tag. And now we have that ID that we've called header. And then I'm going to close the div tag. So now let's see what this looks like in terms of layout. So as you can see, the HTML and the style sheet, because we've defined this div, we're now thinking about things in terms of blocks. So we've created this header block here, which we could replace this generic H1 with maybe a logo that we designed that was the exact size of the header. We now have options, so you can start to think about these blocks and how you can begin to lay out your website. So that's creating an ID, placing it in a div, and then using it to begin to lay out your site or the pages on your site. So once again, these are generic HTML elements that allow you to structure a page and add style across the board. That div, is a block element used to create containers for content or other sections on a page. You can also use an ID inside something called a span. We'll talk about that more when we get to JavaScript. We are going to need to make some changes to our HTML on our pages to apply the divs so we can start to add structure. So I'm going to go back to my text wrangler here. So you see I have another style sheet open, and here I've already worked out all this new code that I want to apply in terms of all of these IDs that I've created. So I'm going to copy all that and move it into my style 1. I'm going to get rid of this header that we just applied. So now looking at my style sheet, we have a header ID, we have a nav ID, and we have some custom styling here within the nav ID. These are for unordered list and list items and link colors. So we want our navigation to look different than just regular links on a page. And this is how we're doing that right here. We're defining it within the nav ID. I have a section ID. That will be the content on our page. And then I also have a footer ID. So I'm going to go ahead and save that style sheet. And it won't really make that big of a difference right now, because I have not defined any of those IDs within divs on my page, except for the header, and we need to fix that one. So I need to go in now and make some changes to my HTML. So I've already done the header here, actually, and I want to move that up. So I want that to be the very first thing. Here is my navigation. So I'm going to do div ID equals nav, and I'm going to close that div right here. Then this begins my content section. So if you remember, that's called section. Keep forgetting to add my quote marks here. Goodness, having a hard time typing. Now I need to close this div way down here because that will all be contained within that section div. And then you remember we added this small class here. Well, I'm just going to make this its own div, and the ID is now going to become footer, and I'm just going to make this a paragraph within it. So now I need to close that div. So I've gone in here, and again, we've already applied all the IDs, footer, section, nav, and header. I've gone into the HTML now, and I've added that ID here for header. I've added the nav div and ID. Here's the section, which will be all of that content, and then I added the footer down here. So let's save this, and now let's apply all of that CSS and see what our site looks like. There you go. We have a completely different website, right? This is now starting to get the look of a site that you would not be ashamed to show to people. So here's our header. You can see we have our custom nav style now with those links to our other pages. We have our section ID right here. We've styled it to be in the middle of the page, contained within this section ID. And then here's our footer div right here. So you can begin to now add even more customization to this. Maybe design a logo that goes right here. Add more pages that fill up your nav setting. Style the images to where the text wraps around them. You can do all kinds of things now moving forward once you've applied that custom style to the rest of your pages. If I go ahead and click on these other pages, you can see there are no differences, or they're reverting back to the old nav because that's all I have in the HTML right now. And I have yet to go in and apply the IDs inside the divs for these. So once I do that, the style will begin to show up there as well.